There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a large room when something is said that cannot be taken back. It is different from the silence that precedes an announcement or the silence that follows a performance. It is the silence of 1,200 people simultaneously understanding that the situation they came to witness has just become something larger than what was advertised. It arrives without warning, and it arrives completely. The way weather arrives in certain parts of the world, not gradually but all at once. And the people inside it know immediately that they are inside it, and that something has changed, and that the change is not reversible. That silence fell over the Hong Kong Coliseum on a Saturday evening in October of 1979 at approximately 9:45 in the evening, when a man named Yang Zi, known to the martial arts world as Bolo Yeung, took a microphone that was not offered to him and used it to say something about Chuck Norris in front of 1,200 people who had paid to attend the Asia-Pacific Martial Arts Invitational and had expected to go home having seen an exhibition tournament, and instead went home having witnessed something that the Hong Kong martial arts community would spend the next 20 years attempt. Hogan was the fourth thing to accurately describe. Snorts. What they witnessed was not a scheduled event. It was not planned by the organizers. It was not sanctioned by the tournament committee. It was the product of one man's accumulated certainty about himself meeting another man's accumulated experience of being tested, in a room large enough to make the collision visible to everyone present and intimate enough that nobody who was there could pretend afterward that they had not seen it clearly. Bolo Yeung was 32 years old that evening. He had been born in Guangzhou in 1946 and had begun training in Chinese martial arts as a young child in the way that serious practitioners of his generation began, which was not as a lifestyle choice or a recreational pursuit, but as the central organizing discipline of a life that had been pointed in that direction from the beginning. He had developed a physique across 2 decades of training that was genuinely extraordinary by any standard available in 1979, before the vocabulary of bodybuilding and strength conditioning had fully merged with the vocabulary of martial arts and produced the hybrid athlete that later generations would take for granted. His chest measured 56 inches, his arms were documented at 19 inches in circumference. He had won the Hong Kong Bodybuilding Championship so many consecutive times that the organization had eventually retired the category in his honor, which was either a tribute to his dominance or an acknowledgement that the competition had ceased to function as a competition in any meaningful sense as long as he was entering it. Snorts. He had appeared in several martial arts films by 1979, most notably as a supporting presence in productions that had circulated through the Southeast Asian market, and he had recently completed work on a film that would eventually reach Western audiences and make his face recognizable to a generation of viewers who would know him primarily as the physical embodiment of a certain category of antagonist. His striking power was real. The people who had trained alongside him or absorbed his techniques in controlled demonstration settings described the experience in terms that clustered around the same essential observation, which was that the force generated by his body was categorically different from the force generated by other large men they had encountered, that it had a density and an authority to it that made the impact of a calibrated strike feel different from what the speed of the strike suggested was coming. He was the most physically imposing martial artist in the building that evening. Hogan was the fourth, by a margin that was not close. Chuck Norris was 39 years old. He had flown to Hong Kong from Los Angeles 4 days earlier at the invitation of the tournament organizing committee, who had extended the invitation because his name carried the specific weight in the international martial arts community that 6 consecutive world championships and a film career built on genuine physical skill had purchased over the preceding 15 years. Clears throat. He was not the largest man in the building. He was not the youngest man in the building. He was 5'10" and weighed approximately 170 pounds in the autumn of 1979, and he had been retired from full contact competition for 4 years. What he was, in the specific and irreducible sense that matters in rooms full of people who understand what they are looking at, was the most experienced man in the building. Experience in the sense that he had spent the better part of 2 decades having his theories about what worked tested against men who were trying their hardest to prove the theories wrong, and had arrived through that extended testing process at the particular quality of self-knowledge that cannot be manufactured or performed or accumulated through any path except the path of genuine pressure applied over genuine time. He had flown to Hong Kong to judge the senior division final and present the championship trophy and say a few words to the assembled practitioners about the state of martial arts exchange between East and West. He had not flown to Hong Kong to be challenged in front of 1,200 people. He had not anticipated the possibility because the possibility had not announced itself in any of the communications he had received from the organizing committee. Snorts. It announced itself instead at 9:45 on a Saturday evening through the specific mechanism of a microphone in the hands of a man who had decided that the presence of 1,200 witnesses was an opportunity rather than a constraint. The Hong Kong Coliseum in 1979 was not the renovated facility it would become in later decades. It was a functional arena, built for capacity rather than comfort, with seating that rose steeply from the competition floor and a lighting arrangement that left the upper sections in a permanent partial shadow that the people seated there had learned to compensate for by leaning forward slightly in their chairs. The competition floor itself was well lit and large, an elevated platform surrounded by a 2-foot barrier that separated the competitors from the front row of spectators. The 1,200 people present that evening were not a casual audience. The Asia-Pacific Martial Arts Invitational drew practitioners and coaches and serious students from across the region, people who had traveled from Singapore and Taiwan and Japan and the Philippines and the mainland, to watch competition at a level that their local scenes did not regularly produce. They understood what they were watching when they watched it. They could read technique, they could assess distance management and timing, and the specific quality of an entry or a combination that told an informed observer something real about the person executing it. This was not an audience that could be easily impressed by performance divorced from substance, and it was not an audience that could fail to recognize substance when substance was genuinely present. Snorts greater than the tournament had run its scheduled program across the afternoon and into the evening without incident. The senior division final had been contested between a Thai kickboxer named Prasong Sitachok and a Japanese karateka named Kenji Watanabe, and had been decided in the third round by a clean body kick that dropped Watanabe to one knee and produced a stoppage that the 1,200 people in the building received with the specific appreciative noise of an audience that has just seen something technically correct and physically decisive. Chuck had presented the trophy from the judges' table at the edge of the competition platform with a few brief words through the tournament interpreter that landed well enough to produce a warm response from the crowd. The program was essentially finished. The organizing committee chairman was preparing to make closing remarks. The evening was approximately 8 minutes from its scheduled conclusion. Bolo Yeung was seated in the front row with 4 members of his training group. He had competed in the Masters division earlier in the afternoon and had won his bracket in 3 consecutive matches that had lasted a combined total of less than 4 minutes and had left the 3 men who entered those matches with him in various states of physical discomfort that the tournament medical team had attended to with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to this outcome when Bolo Yeung was competing. Clear's throat. He had watched Chuck present the trophy. He had watched the crowd respond to Chuck with the warmth that crowds extend to men whose reputations precede them into rooms and generate goodwill independent of anything the man actually does inside the room. And something in that observation had connected with something he had been carrying around inside him for a period of time that the people who knew him well could not precisely identify but estimated had been building for at least the length of the current tournament season. He stood up from the front row. He reached across the barrier and took the microphone from the tournament announcer's stand at the edge of the platform in the direct, unhesitating way of a man who has decided what he is going to do and has moved past the point where the decision is available for reconsideration. The announcer looked at him. The announcer made a brief motion toward the microphone that stopped when he registered the dimensions of the man holding it. The organizing committee chairman, mid-sentence in the closing remarks he had been preparing, stopped speaking. 1,200 people looked at the front row. Bolo's voice through the arena speakers was deeper than the microphone had been designed to carry cleanly, and it produced a slight distortion in the lower frequencies that gave his words a quality of physical weight that matched the physical weight of the man producing them. He thanked the organizing committee, he thanked the tournament for the invitation. He said these things in the abbreviated way that a man says the things he is required to say before he says the thing he came to say. Then he said the thing he came to say. Snorts. He said, that he had watched the martial arts world celebrate certain names for reasons that had more to do with film production than with genuine fighting ability. He said that the West had produced a generation of martial arts celebrities whose reputations had been constructed by cameras and publicists and the particular machinery of a film industry that understood how to make physical skill look more complete than it was. He said that he had been a serious practitioner for more than 20 years, and that in 20 years of serious practice, he had developed a specific capacity to assess another man's genuine fighting ability independent of the reputation attached to that man's name. He said all of this while standing in the front row with the microphone in one hand, and his eyes on Chuck Norris, who was still seated at the judges' table 12 feet away, with his hands folded in his lap, and his expression unchanged from the expression it had been carrying for the previous 20 minutes, which was the expression of a man listening carefully to something he has not yet finished hearing. Then Bolo said the thing that produced the silence. He said that Chuck Norris would not last 30 seconds with him on the competition platform. He said it in Cantonese first, and then in the English he had been developing across years of working in the international film industry. He said both versions clearly enough that there was no ambiguity in either language about what had been said. He said it while looking at Chuck with the direct physical confidence of a man who has spent 30 years developing a body and a set of skills that he has tested under genuine pressure and who believes, with the specific certainty that that kind of development tends to produce, that the belief is accurate. He lowered the microphone slightly. He waited. Snort's 1,200 people waited with him. Chuck had not moved. He had been sitting with his hands folded in his lap when Bolo began speaking, and he was sitting with his hands folded in his lap when Bolo finished. The people closest to the judges' table said later that his face had not changed during the entire duration of Bolo's remarks, that whatever internal processing had occurred in response to what he was hearing had occurred in a place that was not visible from the outside. He looked at Bolo across the 12 feet of space between the judges' table and the front row for a moment that lasted long enough for several people to begin wondering whether he was going to respond at all. Then he stood up. He stood up in the unhurried, deliberate way that he stood up from chairs, which was without any of the preparatory gestures that men use when they want to signal that they are about to do something significant, and the standing itself became the signal by default. The 1,200 people in the Hong Kong Coliseum made the sound that 1,200 people make when a man they have been watching passively for 2 hours stands up in response to a challenge issued publicly in front of all of them. Clears throat. It was not a cheer. It was not a collective intake of breath exactly. It was the sound of 1,200 people simultaneously recalibrating their understanding of what the next 10 minutes of their evening was going to contain. He said one thing before he walked to the platform. He said it in the direction of the organizing committee chairman, not loudly but in the flat, carrying voice of a man who had spent years projecting across training floors and did not need volume to be heard clearly in a quiet room. He said that he would need 2 minutes to stretch. He said it the way a man says he needs 2 minutes to stretch, which was as a practical statement about physical preparation and not as a performance of confidence or a rhetorical move in the exchange that had just been initiated. He walked to the side of the platform and stretched his hamstrings against the barrier with the methodical attention of a man who takes preparation seriously regardless of what the room is doing around him. Bolo watched him from the front row. The 1,200 people watched both of them. The tournament interpreter stood near the platform with the specific expression of a person whose professional responsibilities have just expanded considerably beyond what the job description anticipated. Snorts. Chuck finished stretching. He removed the sport coat he had been wearing for the presentation ceremony and folded it once and handed it to a tournament official. Underneath he was wearing a plain dark shirt tucked into dark slacks. He stepped onto the competition platform in the dress shoes he had worn for the trophy presentation. He did not ask for training shoes. He did not ask for a gi or a belt or any of the equipment that the tournament had available at the officials' table along the near wall. He walked to the center of the platform in his dress shoes and his dark slacks and his plain dark shirt, and stood with his hands loose at his sides and his weight distributed evenly on both feet and his eyes on Bolo Yeung with the open, undefended attention of a man who has learned that the most useful thing at the beginning of any genuine exchange is simply to see what is actually in front of him. Snorts. Bolo stepped onto the platform from the front row. He was wearing a training top and competition pants from the earlier bracket matches. He rolled his neck once. He settled into a wide-rooted stance with his hands raised and his weight dropped low in the way of a man whose physical foundation is so substantial that lowering the center of gravity further is a genuine strategic option rather than a stylistic preference. He looked at Chuck across the 12 feet between them and the 1,200 people in the Hong Kong Coliseum, looked at both of them, and the organizing committee chairman stood at the side of the platform and said the word that in any language and in any room means the same thing. He said fight. Bolo came forward. He moved faster than his dimensions suggested he would move, And this had been surprising people for the entire length of his competitive career because the dimensions were so extreme that the nervous system of any opponent who had not previously encountered him tended to underestimate the speed by a margin that created problems before the opponent had finished adjusting for it. He threw a lead hand jab that covered the distance between them in less time than the senior practitioners in the front rows had estimated it would cover, and Chuck moved his head off the center line in the compact shoulder rotation that removed the target without advertising the movement. The same movement that cost nothing in terms of positioning and gave nothing away in terms of intention. The jab went past. Chuck did not counter. He circled right. He kept his hands low and his eyes on Bolo's chest. The place experienced fighters keep their eyes when they want to read the whole body rather than the face or the hands. The place where the body's intentions announce themselves a fraction of a second before the hands act on them. Clears throat. Bolo threw a right cross. Full commitment. The kind of strike that men of his physical development produce when they decide to commit, which carries not just the weight and the speed of the arm, but the organized force of a body that has spent 20 years learning how to transfer mass into motion at the precise moment of impact. Chuck slipped inside it. He slipped inside it the way a much smaller, much faster man slips inside a big committed punch, by reading the commitment before the punch left the shoulder and moving in the quarter second that opened between the decision and the execution. He threw a lead hand palm strike to Bolo's sternum, short, controlled. The power of a strike intended to communicate rather than to punish. The communication was the same communication that Chuck's strikes always carried in these moments, which was that the distance belongs to me and you do not have access to it on your terms. The palm strike landed flush and Bolo felt it, and the feeling of it was the feeling of a man who has just received accurate information about something he had estimated incorrectly. Snorts. He reset. He circled. He threw a body kick with the lead leg, a genuine weapon thrown by a man with genuine kicking ability, directed at Chuck's left side with the kind of hip rotation that multiplies the effective mass behind the strike by a factor that makes the resulting impact significantly heavier than the speed of delivery suggests. Chuck checked it with his lead shin, absorbing the energy through the bone, in the way that practitioners who have spent years conditioning their legs against hard surfaces absorb it, and stepped into Bolo's space behind the check and drove a short lead elbow toward Bolo's jaw. He pulled it. He pulled it with the specific precision of a man who knows exactly where the elbow is at every point in its arc and can stop it at any point that intention selects. It stopped 2 inches from Bolo's jaw and held there for the half second required for the geometry to be legible to everyone watching. Then Chuck stepped back. He stepped back 2 full paces and stood with his hands at his sides. Snorts. He did not follow. He did not press the moment. He stood at the distance he had established and waited with the same open, patient quality of attention he had brought to the platform when he stepped onto it. The 1,200 people in the Hong Kong Coliseum produced the sound that 1,200 people produce when they have just watched something they did not expect to watch and do not yet have the framework to fully account for. It was not the sound of a crowd watching a fight. It was something more complicated and more attentive than that. It was the sound of 1,200 people who understood martial arts watching a man manage distance against a physically superior opponent with a precision so complete that the physical superiority had been rendered functionally irrelevant and were in the process of incorporating that observation into what they believed they knew about the relationship between size and skill. 22 seconds had elapsed since the organizing committee chairman had said the word that means fight. 22 seconds, 8 seconds inside the margin that Bolo Yeung had named in front of all of them. Clears throat. Bolo stood on the competition platform. He had not been struck with full force. There was nothing on him that a camera would have recorded as damage. But the elbow that had stopped 2 inches from his jaw had arrived there from inside his own committed kick, which meant it had arrived while he was still in motion and still committed and completely unable to interrupt it. And the specific knowledge that produced in the body of a serious practitioner is a knowledge that cannot be argued with or explained away because it does not live in the mind where arguments and explanations are manufactured. It lives in the nervous system. It lives in the place where the body keeps the information that is true regardless of the story. The mind is currently telling about the encounter. He stood on the platform and the 1,200 people in the Hong Kong Coliseum watched him stand there and understood what they were watching, which was a man receiving information that was accurate and that conflicted with the information he had been operating on when he picked up the microphone 20 minutes ago. Chuck walked toward him. 3 steps across the platform in his dress shoes. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at Bolo with the same expression he had worn since before the organizing committee chairman had said the word. Not satisfaction. Not the performed magnanimity of a man who has won something and wants the room to know that he is being gracious about it. Something more straightforward and more useful than either of those things. He extended his right hand. Bolo looked at the hand for a moment that the people in the front rows said lasted about 3 seconds. Then he took it. Snorts. Chuck shook it once. He said something. He said it quietly enough that only Bolo and the tournament interpreter heard it, and the interpreter, when asked about it in subsequent years by people who had been in that arena and wanted to know what had been said, consistently declined to repeat it on the grounds that it had been said to one person and not to the building. What the interpreter would say, when pressed, was that what Chuck had said was not what any of the people asking him expected it to have been. That it was not a rebuke and not a lecture and not the kind of statement a man makes when he has just demonstrated something and wants the demonstration to be accompanied by a verbal explanation of its significance. He would say that it was the kind of thing a man says when he has genuine respect for the person he is saying it to and wants the person to know that the respect is independent of what just occurred between them. Chuck released the handshake, he walked off the platform, he picked up the sport coat from the tournament official and put it on. He walked back to the judge's table and sat down and folded his hands in his lap. The organizing committee chairman walked to the microphone with the expression of a man who has just watched his closing remarks become unnecessary and is attempting to determine what replaces them. He said thank you to both men. He said it in Cantonese and in English. He said that the Asia-Pacific Martial Arts Invitational was honored to have witnessed what it had witnessed that evening. He said the word honored in a way that made it clear he meant it and was not simply producing the formula that tournament chairmen produce at the end of programs. Then he said good night. The 1,200 people in the Hong Kong Coliseum stood up. They did not cheer, they applauded. Snorts, the specific applause of a large room that has just understood it has witnessed something that cannot be adequately celebrated by cheering because cheering is the response to a performance, and what they had watched was not a performance. It was a demonstration. The difference between those two things is the difference between watching something that was arranged to produce a specific response and watching something that simply occurred and produced its own response independent of anyone's intention. Chuck left the arena through a side exit. He had a car waiting. He did not speak with the press, he had not arranged to speak with the press, and he had not changed his arrangements in response to what had happened on the platform. He drove to his hotel near the harbor with the same unremarkable self-sufficiency that characterized the way he moved through every context, the quality of a man who does not require the external confirmation of the room to know what occurred inside it. Bolo Yeung remained in Hong Kong for another week before returning to his training schedule. The incident at the Asia-Pacific Invitational was not discussed by him publicly in the immediate aftermath. He continued working, he continued competing, he continued developing as a practitioner in the patient, methodical way of a man who takes the practice seriously enough to learn from every experience it produces, including the experiences that produce information he was not expecting. In the years that followed, he built a film career that brought his name and his physical presence to audiences worldwide. He never claimed publicly to have defeated Chuck Norris. He never offered a revisionist account of the 22 seconds on the platform. The people who knew him in the Hong Kong martial arts community said that the quality most notable about him in the years after that evening was a quality of careful listening that had not been equally notable about him in the years before it. Clear's throat. The story moved out from the Hong Kong Coliseum in the way that stories move when 1,200 people have witnessed something, and all 1,200 of them go home and tell someone. It traveled across the Southeast Asian martial arts circuit through dojos and competition programs, and the slow international grapevine that connected serious practitioners in 1979 with the same gradual certainty that the internet would connect them 20 years later, only slower and with more distortion in the retelling. Most versions got some details wrong. The core of every version was the same. A man had stood up in the front row of a major international martial arts tournament and taken a microphone and named a number. The number was 30 seconds. The man sitting at the judge's table had stood up and stretched his hamstrings against the platform barrier and stepped onto the floor in his dress shoes. 22 seconds later, the question had been answered, with an elbow that stopped 2 inches from a jaw and a hand extended downward toward the man who had asked it. There are men who enter rooms with a number already calculated. The number represents the gap they believe exists between themselves and the person across from them. They have arrived at the number through a private accounting process that has taken place without the participation of the person across from them, and the number feels accurate because it has never been tested against the person it concerns in conditions that would permit reality to revise it. The number 30 seconds had felt accurate to the man who named it in front of 1,200 people in the Hong Kong Coliseum on a Saturday evening in October of 1979. It was accurate in the sense that 30 seconds was approximately the amount of time the exchange required. It was inaccurate in the specific and important sense that the outcome it anticipated did not correspond to the outcome the 30 seconds produced. The gap between those two things, between the number a man names in confidence and the number the mat confirms when the mat is finally consulted, is the gap that every serious practitioner eventually has to cross. Most cross it in private, in the specific mercy of a training environment, where the crossing is witnessed only by people who are also engaged in the same project of finding out what is true. Some cross it in front of 1,200 people who understand exactly what they are watching and will remember the crossing for the rest of their lives. The crossing is the same either way. The mat does not adjust its findings based on the size of the audience. It finds what it finds and reports it with the same flat, indifferent accuracy it has always reported everything, which is complete and immediate, and without any of the courtesies that the man who named the number was hoping it might extend.